Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be getting started shortly. Just waiting for our guests to join us. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be starting shortly. Hi, Jamal. How are you?
Hey, good evening. How are you?
I'm doing well. So good to see you.
Likewise, it has been way too long.
Uh, it's always way too long, but you know what? Always right on time.
Yes, yes, indeed.
We have a lot of work to do. I'm just trying to adjust my camera here, and I think our other guest has joined us as well. So let me bring him up. Yep, there he is. Hey, Charles, how are you?
Hey, how are you all doing? Okay, good. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Doing well.
Excellent.
Uh, so, look, I know this is going to be a very meaty and robust conversation. So I'm going to get us started so we can jump right in because I know this is a
Absolutely.
topic that everyone has been thinking about and really would love to hear both of your thoughts.
Mhm.
So good evening to everyone who has joined us on this National Urban League Live. Our conversation is part of our Justice Now series. And tonight we're here to talk about what's at stake in the November midterm elections. I am your host from the National Urban League. I'm Jerica Richardson, and I serve as a Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the League. And just really excited to have two distinguished leaders on with us this evening. I will give you a little bit about their bio, but I'm also going to turn it to them to share a little bit about their work in this space. So I am joined by Charles Ellison. Charles is Principal and Chief Strategist of BE Strategy, a multimedia communications firm with operations in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. Charles is publisher of the bnote.com, and he is widely known as the executive producer and host of the Reality Check, the flagship daily public affairs program on WURD radio and WURD TV. Now, Charles has a lot of other very important and great titles because he has been really working in this space as probably one of the chief journalists that really has been lifting up a lot of the work in the social justice space. So I'm going to kick it to Charles in a moment to tell us a little bit more about him and his work. But I'd also like to introduce my colleague and counterpart in the movement, Jamal Watkins. Jamal currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. Now, you all may remember Jamal, from this time last year, when we were talking about really the important issues that impact the Black community, the importance of really pushing back on a lot of these voting challenges that we have seen popping up across the country. And really that work still continues. So we brought Jamal back to kind of talk about where we are now and where we're going forward. So Charles, Jamal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerica.
So just to kind of set the stage for tonight's conversation, if you all would just share a minute or two, a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing, what you're talking about, what you're discussing as it relates to these midterm elections coming up, but as it relates to movement work and really the continuation of uplifting Black people as a whole. So Charles, I'll start with you and then we'll kick it over to Jamal.
Sure, sure. Thanks so much, Jerica. Really a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. You're great to be on panel with you, Jamal. And yeah, very proud of the work that we do, but also very busy with that work that we do each day on WURD through Reality Check. That's public affairs programming that I'm executive producing 3 hours a day. Well, 3 hours, 4 days a week. In addition to our environmental justice journalism project that we call EcoWord, which I'm the managing editor of, and I also created that about several years ago. But that also intersects with these very critical, crucial issues that are being covered, that are being discussed in these midterm congressional elections. You know, you've got some serious major Senate races, especially in my home state of Pennsylvania, and also in a number of other battleground states. But, you know, we should be paying very close, which we do as well, pay very close attention to what's happening on the state level, because we've got state legislative races. I believe that it hasn't been until recently where people are starting to realize how important, how consequential the state capitals are. So, you know, if you haven't already, start getting familiar with who your state representatives are in your particular state, or your state senators. And then you'll find that we've got the types of people who are feeling like 2020 was rigged, or the types of people who are against our voting rights, against our human rights, against our environmental rights. Right now, they run the majority of state legislatures and state capitals. And so we're watching those races very closely. We're also watching gubernatorial or governor's races too. So a lot of that busy work on Reality Check, but I work with a number of organizations. One organization that I work very closely with that's positioned in many of those key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and elsewhere. And some of these states already have major battleground races, gubernatorial, Senate races, even House races that we're looking at, but all voting is local. You know, they've been doing some great work since some of them. We're working very closely with them, especially on issues like mail-in ballots and expanding voting rights, and also being on the front line of that fight to protect our voting rights. So I've been doing some great work with them, and they've been partnering up with us on Reality Check WURD. But, you know, as far as issues, real quick, Jerica, that we're focused on regularly on Reality Check and also on the bnote.com, definitely that voting rights issue. Definitely talking about and emphasizing to people how high the stakes are in 2022. I know people are saying, well, you told us that in 2020. Okay, well, we're telling you that again in 2022, and you can make the argument that the stakes are much higher in 2022. We are on the cusp in a really big way, more so this year than we were in that last cycle. So definitely focused on that, and very much focused as far as for me personally, and also for my audience, we are very extra focused on climate crisis and environmental justice. This is a #1 issue, especially for Black people. It is not a white people's conversation. We are the ones that are disproportionately impacted by these very climatic, catastrophic changes that we're seeing our planet go through, that we're seeing our spaces, the spaces that we're in. And also environmental justice deals with issues of housing, also deals with issues of cost of living. It's about the spaces we live in. So definitely, you know, we want Black voters also to be eco voters. We should be the leaders. We should be leading on that topic of environment. And so we're really pressing hard with that as well, and making people more aware and conscious, and showing how that issue intersects and influences all those other issues that are important to us as well.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. Look, there's a lot to unpack with what you just shared there, and I look forward to diving deeper into those issues in this conversation. But now I want to turn it over to Jamal, just to talk to us a little bit about what he and the NAACP are really doing, and the work that they're doing in this space, and what they're focusing on in this cycle.
Yeah, thank you, Jerica and Charles. It's good to be with you. The NAACP, at its 113th year of existence, is really doubling down on what we are responsible for. So when you think about our members, our volunteers, our activists in community after community, it is the African-American community, Black folks who are working and living day in and day out with the realities of this nation. And so when we think about the work of the association, even after 113 years of existence, we are dedicated and focused on policy advocacy connected to racial equity. I'm using those words specifically because at the end of the day, it's about moving a winning agenda that makes life better for the Black communities we serve. And we do that, of course, by centering civic engagement and looking at the notion that everyone has a voice at the ballot box, that every vote counts. And I know for some people, they are tired of hearing that, but that is the actual journey and the Olympics that we're in, this Olympics of voting, if you will. And the other side, although we're nonpartisan, we're not blind, there is another side to this thing that says Black folks shouldn't participate at the highest level. Black folks should stay at home. Black folks should accept what they are being given by the government, if you will. And so our goal is to optimize Black voter turnout and Black civic engagement at all costs, because that is the currency that matters most. The second thing I would lift up is this notion that I think Charles was teasing at this about supportive policies and institutions. What are the things that actually matter to the Black community directly? We know that folks have been upset about high gas prices. Folks are looking at their bank accounts, figuring out how to make ends meet and to connect the dots. But we also know that when the 2020 election was over and there was a President Joe Biden, that there were millions of American families that got a child tax credit. And that for families that I know that actually benefited from this new administration were being financially lifted up out of poverty by an administration that was accountable to the community. But the thing is, we got to keep that going. We can't actually rest on our laurels. So one election doesn't make or break the country, even though I think 2016 broke us all down in a different way. But 2020 showed us that if we come together, stay focused, create a natural narrative that says no matter what, we got to get to the polls and vote folks that think like us, believe like us, and connect to our issues, that then we can shift the paradigm. And so we know that that work is a continuing work, and it's tiring and exhausting. But for my organization and for partner organizations like the Urban League, we are committed because we know at the end of the day, what's at stake in November is actually our livelihood, our existence, what matters to communities day in and day out. And so for us, that ends up being the cornerstone and the focus of the work today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Thank you, Jamal. You know what? And that I think really tees up the first part of this conversation. You talked about kind of the timeline and some of the things that we saw from 2016 on. I will say that in 2020, one of the motivating factors for many folks was not only the pandemic and what we were experiencing, but this issue of equity and justice when we thought about the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And so I think one of the things that galvanized people to head to the polls was they took their protest and really were advocating for real policy changes as it relates to policing and accountability in this country and the brutality that we saw over and over and over again on Black bodies. And so I think one of the things that we have to discuss and have to be really honest about as we think about how are Black folks going to show up and turn out and really continue the push that we saw in 2020 in this midterm election cycle. And I ask that because some of what we've been hearing from folks is they feel a little discouraged. There were two things that we saw people continue to raise from our community over and over again. You both touched on them. It was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but it was also voting rights, protecting our access to the ballot box, making sure that there was regulation and policies on the national level to protect folks from some of the challenges and things that they were experiencing in their localities on the state and on the local level. And we saw this massive pushback. It felt like in some ways that we were taking multiple steps back from some of the gains that we had finally been starting to see. And so I want to talk about that. From your perspective, Jamal, I'll start with you and then go to Charles. Are you seeing that discouragement that I've heard? And how do we respond to that? Really, how do we remind folks what's at stake in November?
Well, Jerica, the reality is that Black folks have carried a burden in this nation for hundreds of years. We are tired because the burden of being Black in this nation is connected to almost every disadvantage you could imagine. But yet and still, we're resilient. We fight forward and we do what it takes to show up. And so when I think about the electoral politics game and the numbers game, there is no other community that shows up in the strongest voting bloc like the Black community. Approximately 90% of Black folks, when they go to vote for the progressive candidate. Now, I say that because there's one party that overwhelmingly benefits from that, and there's another party that doesn't. And guess how the thing plays out? The other party that doesn't benefit from Black voter turnout does everything in its power to create roadblocks to voting. barriers to voting. And we have seen that since about 2010 in terms of the massive voter suppression laws. And even last year, they keep being piled on because they know when we vote for the issues that matter to us and the issues that are connected to our communities. The other side is that there is a group of folks who benefit from us and they know they benefit from us. And so some of them take us for granted. Say that again. Slow that down. Some of them take us for granted. Yes, I will name him, Senator Joe Manchin. And when we think about senators like that who literally benefit from the progressive Black vote, who then get into office and don't do the right thing to make sure that voting rights is upheld at the highest level and that economic incentives are invested in at the higher level, then we got to ask our questions, wait a minute, maybe those are the wrong individuals to be in those seats. And although a couple of them, and I would think, Senator Sinema's among that grouping, they're not up for re-election in 2022. But in 2024, their card is going to be up. And so we have to ask the question, if we vote in a 90% voting block, let's kick them out of office and put the right people in office that represent our agenda. But I will say that not getting police reform, not getting the justice in policing that we have fought for is disappointing. Not getting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is disappointing. But we also know that we did a thing in 2020 where we kicked out somebody who I would argue was representing an agenda that was detrimental not only to Americans, all Americans, but in particular Americans of color. And so that individual who also was responsible, in my opinion, for January 6th is still out there. He is still on the come up, if you will. And so our vote is not just about holding Democrats accountable, those in power right now accountable. It's also making sure that folks like a Donald Trump, and yes, I'm naming him, folks that believe that they can hijack elections, believe that they can terrorize communities of color and immigrant communities, never have a chance and an opportunity to hold public office in the future. And so for me and for our organizations, we're not only playing defense, but we're playing offense. And so in states like Florida, where we know that we're going to have to fight it out and we may not win everything, we got to keep the pressure on, because at the end of the day, the other side is dogmatic. The other side is filled with racism and all types of classism, anything you can think of to take away our power. And so it's a real fight. And that fight has to be realized, even though at times we're discouraged and we're fatigued, but we understand that the stakes are too high to really, really take our foot off the gas, if you will.
Thank you, Jamal. Charles, I just want to, expand on that question a little bit and talk about faith in the process. Right. So, there was discouragement, there was disappointment that we weren't able to move on these policy issues. But now so many folks and so many, I think, leaders in our community are, encouraging folks to turn out and continue the fight in spite of. But quite frankly, I think there is concern that will they even have access to the polls when they show up? Do they have faith in the electoral system, especially with all the different laws that are popping up around the country and continue to pop up? That just makes it seem more challenging and hard. Charles, can you speak to that piece?
It's not about our faith in the electoral system, we as Black people, it's about our faith in maximum, relentless Black voter turnout. Black voter turnout, and when I say, and I'm going to use the word before that, maximum, I'm not just talking about, Jamal is absolutely right. We have a Black voting bloc that typically, 90% of it typically will go towards the progressive or the Democratic candidate. I can probably speak in more partisan terms. But maximum means, we need to start imagining an electoral landscape where we're coming out at like, if there are 90% of us who are eligible to register to vote, then 90% of us need to turn out. We have to start imagining a political landscape or a political game board where we're dominating that board and we're turning out at 70, 80, 90%, 100% levels. It makes no sense that we have limited representation in Congress in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, when we're 30 to 40% of the population. So, those are instances. We saw that in 2017, for example, with the election of Doug Jones. And I got a lot of pushback about this where I'm saying, hey, there's absolutely no reason why the Democratic or the progressive candidate can't get elected in a state that's nearly 40% Black. People are like, no, no, that's not going to happen. See, it's like, it's that lack of imagination and that lack of vision. That imagination, Black electoral imagination and vision, have to be big, bold, and relentless. We should not be having a conversation about whether or not we should be voting. This should be a relentless exercise every 6 months. On the state, local, federal level, there's always an election. I always tell people about the 3 Ps: the protest, the politics, and the policy, right? And so everything's going to start off with that protest demand, but then you got to have that protest demand translating into the politics. And let me tell you, the election losers don't determine policy. The election winners do. That's just the way it works. I mean, I'm not a fan at all of Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, but he said it right. He's like, hey, listen, election winners, they craft policy. Election losers, they don't. So do we want to be election as Black people, and particularly with the stakes always being as high as they are, we have to always be like on watch, and we always have to be on guard and ready at moments electoral notice to get activated and mobilized. So we can be election winners or winning the politics, the campaigns and elections, and flexing at maximum numbers. And then when we're in that position, we can craft, we can shape, we can demand the kind of policy that we want. We proved that to ourselves in 2020 when we flexed. You know, people talk about the Electoral College, and they're like, oh, I don't like the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an HBCU, y'all. It's a historically Black college and university because we're the ones who were most clustered and heavily concentrated in those key critical battleground states. So you see what happened in Georgia, how the Electoral College, how that shook out. Look at what happened in Pennsylvania, my home state. Pennsylvania, my little corner of Philadelphia, my hometown, we won that 2020 election, right? So it's like we saw what's possible when we're in states, when we're in high population clusters in states like Georgia, like Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Michigan, Detroit, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, or when our brown and indigenous brothers and sisters are clustered in states like Arizona. Look at what happened there, right? So it's, you know, we have to, one of the good things about Black voters, especially when we're turning out at maximum numbers, is we are the savviest and the smartest and most strategic voters in the country, in the nation, historically. So now in order for us to like have that manifest into the type of policy that we want, where we do finally get the voting rights that we need, because the Voting Rights Act was overturned in 2008 and 2013. I wish there was more noise made about it back then. Like we had the kind of the justifiable noise that we needed about the overturning of Roe v. Wade here in 2022. Mm-hmm. But we can start, if we come out in maximum numbers and we mobilize in that way and we're relentless about it. And people do, the people who are the enemies of our humanity, the people who are the enemies of, who are trying to destroy not just our rights, but our humanity, they know how valuable our vote is. Why wouldn't we want to turn out? Why wouldn't we want to flex our electoral muscle, knowing that these people have spent enormous amounts of time and resources and money actively mobilizing to destroy our vote? That's what the January 6th attack on Capitol Hill was about. It was a white lash. It was a direct response to how powerful the Black vote flexed in November 2020. And they were upset about that. So now it's literally just being upset about that. I mean, that's literally I mean, the Republican Party now is like a terrorist organization. It's operating as one right now, with basically focused on destroying our humanity. So why wouldn't we want to, and politics being the game of addition that it always is, why wouldn't we want to mass up, to gear up, to get registered? And it's not just about the registration, it is about the turnout. Because we have this situation where we have many people registered, but then we're not turning out at the maximum numbers that we need in a lot of those states that I mentioned. That is what we need to do, state and federal, by this November, if we want to get the kind of policy change, or if we want our protest demands met. We've got to win in the political space.
Thanks, Charles. One thing I've been scrolling through the questions on this call, and so here's one I screenshot. How do we organize a national mobilization, voter registration, and actually get folks to the polls? You kind of just talked about this and the need for us to do it. They mentioned, let's take a page from BLM, Black Lives Matter, and utilize social media to the highest degree. Jamal, I know your work on the day-to-day is strategy. So we all know that it's important, if we want to get some of these policies that we discussed across the finish lines, that we need the large turnout, that we need folks to show up, that there must be mobilization. But from your perspective, what does that look like on a national level? What is the strategy to get the turnout that we need in the Black community for the Black vote? Taking into account that although you, Charles, and I are singing from the same, singing the same song and saying, how can we even ask? This is something we must do. Not everybody's there. How do we get them there? And then what is the strategy to make sure people are not only registered, but they follow through in midterms, which we know historically the turnout in our community goes down. How do we get a different outcome this midterm election? Because right now, I think if any time in history we needed folks to show up when they don't normally do, it's now.
So I would argue, Jerica, it's a perfectly framed question that it's about, doing a few things and doing them in a deep way. And I'll start off with an example of what it means to do hyperlocal investment in elections, because we know that there is an infrastructure and an economy around voting that some folks forget about. There are people who spend millions of dollars, up to billions of dollars, in order to make sure that people are educated and persuaded and pushed and pulled to show up in certain ways. We in the Black community have the same capacity in some ways to do that type of deep investment, but it's nuanced. And the example I'll give you is recently we played in a district attorney race in the great state of Tennessee in Memphis, Shelby County. And it was a race where there was an incumbent, a woman who was not right for our community, but she kept getting reelected. And we said with our local volunteers, and I'm talking thousands of volunteers, we need a victory. We got to swing the paradigm. We got to shift this thing in the right direction. So it required us to partner. It required us to invest real dollars, and I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for radio and digital, yes, the things that reach people, but it also required us to leverage and optimize people in community to knock on doors. Now, I know COVID, we're in this endemic phase, and so we had to put on masks and make sure we were socially distancing, but talking to people, neighbor to neighbor, texting our neighbors, communicating with our neighbors in a hyper-local way is still the best way, not only to get folks to be connected to their power, but also to motivate each other to go and do that thing which is not exciting or sexy all the time, and that is to vote, especially in hyper-local races. And we won. The incumbent district attorney is no more in Shelby County. There's a new DA, and there's a new day, and now we got to hold this gentleman accountable. But there are other elections and other races down ballot that matter to folks in a real world, real-time way that we have to connect the dots on. The second thing is we have to understand that it is collectively we. Urban League only matters and benefits when NAACP is strong and vice versa. The movement for Black lives, that's me. That's our children, that's our grandchildren, that's us. If we don't understand that our power is in the broader ecosystem, then we lose before we even start. And so we have to find ways to say that if Black Lives Matter, for example, is shaking the table in the streets, and the Urban League is in the boardroom cutting the deals to make sure resources are flowing, and the NAACP is on TV singing the right messaging, that all three entities, if you will, are working together to shift and build power for the Black community, because we are the Black community. So I would argue that we can't lose sight that our unification of direction and purpose actually matters. So deep investment in hyperlocal races and communities, being united and a united front as organizations matter. And then the last thing I would say, and this is probably something that speaks specifically to what Charles is lifting up, is that we have to recognize our power. London Breed is the mayor of a city, the city of San Francisco. Only 5 Black people live in San Francisco. The population of Black folks in San Francisco is less than 5%. but she is the mayor of that city. Because guess what? Black folks, just like anybody else, are intelligent and brilliant and can lead. And we have to run races everywhere, not just in the urban centers where a whole lot of us are clustered, but in places where we may not fully exist. Because at the end of the day, this voting thing is about endurance, it's about turnout, it's about numbers. And when Black folks show up in a block, we swing elections. And so our goal is to make sure that we harness our power, but also make sure that we use this political system to the fullest extent. We want to overdose, if you will, on turnout. We want to make sure that we have candidates running everywhere and in every seat, because at the end of the day, the other side does this and does this well. And in some cases, they don't govern so well, clearly. And so we want to make sure that we're positioning and centering our voice and our power through not only investing in hyperlocal elections, staying unified, but making sure that our candidates are on the ballot everywhere possible.
I love that. Knowing our power. Charles, I am coming straight to you, because one of the things that Jamal mentioned was messaging and the importance of messaging. And as the resident journalist on this call, I would love for you to speak to that, the type of messaging that is needed to resonate with voters or potential voters from the Black community that really need to be energized. But I also want you to talk about what is the role of Black media at this time. You know, we can talk about the organizing and some of the advocacy, but I don't want to leave out a critical piece, which is, you know, messaging, media. You know, that's how so many people get their information and news. What should we be hearing from Black journalists?
Right. You know, so Black media needs to be, especially in a very urgent existential moment like now, Black media must be in the business of civic literacy, not infotainment. You know, it's really, we are in a moment where everything hangs in the balance. We're faced with, like I mentioned, climate crisis before. That's a real threat, and it intersects with all the other issues and challenges that we're dealing with as a people. And so we have to be very serious about the types of conversations that we're having. And all of those conversations have to be equity and justice centered. The whole purpose of the goal of the civil rights movement was not so we could live in nice houses, drive nice cars, get vacations, have streets named after us, and get good jobs, right? The whole purpose, the goal of the civil rights movement was for us to achieve full, complete, unmitigated justice. Full stop. That's it. And that's the kind of work that we have to be serious about that. Now, that civic literacy component is so essential. And that's what Black media on all levels across the entire board has to be focused on right now. We have a situation here, and Republicans and those folks who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, those white terrorists, these white domestic terrorists, they know this, and they take full advantage of it, and they leverage it. We have a situation where 54% of Americans can't read beyond an 8th grade level. So they take advantage. So you have to keep the messaging. You got to keep it simple. You got to meet people where they are. You also, another thing that we have to do, especially as Black media, is that we have to have more grassroots conversations. We have to connect our grass tops with our grassroots. Because what's happening is we've got a growing classism divide within the Black community that's been widening. Check that out. In fact, a professor at Georgetown, Cheryl Cashin, talks about this in a newly released book, White Space, Black Hood. You know, we're leaving our neighborhoods behind, and then we're just like, well, you know, if you, sorry to have to go, but I'm going to move out to greener pastures, and we're leaving folks behind, but we're not going to be able to resolve all these collective issues that we keep screaming about if we're all divided like that across socioeconomic lines. So we're going to have to connect our grass tops with our grassroots, and making sure that we're not leaving brothers and sisters back on the block behind, which means that we have to start having a conversation about all those untapped Black voters, particularly in low-income wards or districts, particularly in places like where I grew up in Philadelphia, where there's still hundreds of thousands of voters each and every local election cycle that don't turn out to vote. In fact, our last local primary in Philadelphia, we only had a 23% voter turnout. But the city's 1.6 million, 1.1 million people in the city are registered. And it's a 44% Black city. But it makes no sense that the neighboring county, which has 600,000 people in it, has 41 ballot boxes where you can mail your ballot to. But in Philadelphia, that's 44% Black and 1.6 million people. There are only 15 ballot boxes. So we need infrastructure set. We need civic literacy and infrastructure that's set up to encourage all these hundreds of thousands of untapped Black voters. We found that. We saw that in 2016. We saw it again in 2020, even though we were able to win and bounce back in 2020. We keep leaving folks in distressed, low income, also as we're having issues with high gun violence rates, and also places where you have high rates of chronic disease. But the most distressed of us in those neighborhoods, they don't have the type of election infrastructure that's needed for us to really recognize or realize maximum Black voter turnout. We need to stop leaving those votes on the table and leaving those behind. Black media can help find those votes, can help activate those votes, can help mobilize those votes. That's what Black media needs to be on a steady 24-hour, 7-day-a-week diet of nothing but explaining how important and critical this election is now. And making sure that every last Black voter available who is eligible to register and get out there and vote or mail in a ballot is doing that between now and November 8th. That's what Black media has to be focused on. And not just a Black media outlet like mine, like Word, that's mission focused, but I'm talking about all Black media. I shouldn't have to be looking at my colleagues in the Black media space. I'm going to call them out, like theroot.com, which I used to write for, or The Griot, or Essence, or going into some of these other, like the headlines or the front page or the Atlanta Black Star. And there's absolutely no mention of climate crisis, no mention of rising gun violence rates in our communities, or rising chronic disease rates, or how we're the hardest hit or we're the last ones to recover when hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts and urban heat islands hit, right? So I don't see any headlines about that. So it's like, I don't see any headlines about critical key battleground races that are happening in key states where Black voters are needed, like Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Georgia. Where is that information? Where's that civic literacy? No, we got to stop playing. And we've been playing around and messing around. We've got to let go of all of the games, and we've got to start connecting the protest demands, winning the politics, and shaping and crafting the policy. That's the way we do it.
Thanks, Charles. I see you're getting a lot of love in the chat. I think I just want to pick up on one point that you brought up. Yes, I agree with you about making sure that we reach those folks that are untapped and really we haven't engaged in the way we should. And I think one of those demographics, quite frankly, is also young people. I think the issue of climate change is a great one to lift up, because I definitely think a lot of young people in conversations I've participated in are laser focused on that issue, because they're like, what are you leaving us? What are you leaving the next generation? This is what we have to live in. So I think that's important. And I also want to talk about, when we're talking about folks that are untapped, or sometimes folks, we talked about the higher numbers of registered voters, but then when it comes to turnout, not actually seeing them show up in the polls. I think sometimes it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. The response is, well, there's apathy. I don't think there's really very many apathetic people in the Black community. I know there's a lot of folks that are fired up about at least any one of the issues that we have talked about. And so sometimes I think it is a reminder of the importance in taking a step back and underscoring the importance of access. And I say this because at the National Urban League, we had a brilliant class of interns or resident scholars this summer, and they really took a close look at the issue, talked to their colleagues, did some research. And one of the things they lifted up is that when we are talking about younger voters that are 40 and younger, or 35 and younger, that there are many of them that made attempts in the last election cycles to actually participate in this process. We know a lot of people did mail-in ballots. A lot of people voted through non-traditional means. But even if we take a look at that, we see a lot of folks experience some challenges in that. So when we're talking about folks that are doing mail-in ballots, if you fill out your ballot incorrectly and then you have to mail in another one. I mean, there are sometimes delays in our systems that impact others. And I will say for the young population, one of the things that came up is that so many of them are gig workers. So many of them have jobs that don't make it easy to vote in the same way that it is for folks that do have more flexibility in their job. And when we're looking at these bills across the country, this legislation across the country, it's making it more and more difficult if you don't have the flexibility with early voting that we saw last cycle. That makes it hard. So, I mean, we have stories of young people who have tried as they might, just kept running into impediment and impediment and impediment. And so my question is, let's move aside the apathy piece. How do we make it so that folks, knowing all the hurdles and the obstacles that are out there, how do we help them really be able to cast their ballot in spite of? I mean, some of this is what we have to do in this midterm election. What do we have to do to help folks get there in spite of the challenges, but also being forward thinking so that we don't keep having this conversation? Do we need to make sure that everyone has access to show up, that there is a requirement for their jobs, that there's a national holiday? I mean, what are the things that we need to do so it just doesn't fall, oh, look, these young people or this segment of the Black community, they're just apathetic. I think people care, but we've got to make it much easier to actually do what it is we're asking them to do.
Well, the first thing I would say is you got to actually employ, engage, and let young people lead. And so, you know, I'm about to be 40 something next Monday. I can put on my blazer and my glasses, but I am not.
Happy early birthday.
I thank you. I am not a millennial. I am not a Gen Zer. And so if you're trying to reach Black millennials, you got to have Black millennials leading. If you're Black Gen Zers, you got to have Black Gen Zers leading. If you're trying to reach Black gig economy workers, you got to have Black gig economy folks organizing to lead and to do that engagement. In the Black community, we get it. If Black women are going to get Black women to vote, they're going to talk to each other. You got to get out of the way and let those folks lead. Now, for the NAACP, that means investing in our youth and college division. We have young people from the age of 25 on down to the age of 6 who lead community-based organizations on college campuses and in communities. We need to put money into those groups, give them platforms, listen to them, and let them help us organize their peer group. We have to make sure that we're thinking about our partnership with labor unions and the labor movement. Just recently at our convention, we had those Amazon workers who organized effectively up in New York with us, not because they created something special, which they did, but because they are actively able to reach their peer group, their population of working Black folks, to say we need a change. And so if you don't get out of the way and make sure that our community is being led by the folks we're trying to connect the dots with, we're again going to miss the mark. And so that doesn't say we don't have to follow on traditional means. So you do need messengers, you need celebrities and influencers, preachers and pastors, faith leaders, civic right leaders, all on the same page. But you also got to break it down in that hyperlocal way to say, if we have a crisis in our community where college students or folks under the age of 24 aren't voting, let's go and find the people they're listening to, work with them, engage with them, lift them up so that they can carry that message and help motivate that population so that we can get to goal. And it's not rocket science, but it does require sometimes to take off our leadership hat and pass the mantle on to others who should be leading. The last thing I would say, and I would affirm this with Charles, is that the messengers in our communities matter. And so we have learned in our work that sometimes you got to go to the gospel radio station and talk to them and say, if you're not running some get out the vote ads, some PSAs, we're missing an entire population, and to educate those folks. Sometimes we got to go to the hip hop stations that are running streaming radio. And I know some folks are like, what the hell is that? But streaming radio, folks not listening in their cars, but in their homes. If Hot 97 in New York is not talking about voting, if Charlemagne the God is not talking about voting, we're missing a community in terms of engagement. And yes, we got to get the Griot, the Route 100, Essence, everyone on the same page around tapping into what motivates Black folks to have a good life, but also the policies that affect their good life. Because I will argue, Black folks want good cars, nice cars. They want to go to brunch. You want a good house. You want your kids to go to good. We want all of that good stuff.
All of it.
Policies that get in the way of that, and policymakers that get in the way of that. And so we got to connect the dots. That sometimes your brunch experience is because guess what? You're not getting that child tax credit that you should be getting because somebody is telling Joe Biden no. And so making the connection real helps us to really, I think, get the audiences of folks who don't normally participate in voting to actually participate more.
Yeah, I absolutely, absolutely agree with what Jamal's saying here. He's absolutely right, and the messengers are important. And we have to have some real conversations here. We have to be first real talk, just 100 about what we're faced with here. If we don't get this right, this election, if we're not relentless, also about just the electoral landscape in general, we lose the brunches. We lose the nice cars. We lose that kind of lifestyle. We lose our humanity. This is a real existential threat. We have white fascist terrorism that we're grappling with here. We saw it manifested and unfolding. We still are seeing it unfolding as it tried to overthrow the government in response to how we flexed in 2020 on January 6th. And that's very real. And so I think, and I'm saying this as the father of 2 millennials and one Gen Z, we have to have very honest, very real, very explicit conversations about the types of challenges and threats that we're faced with our young people. And part of having that real talk is about, making those, like I said, those 3P connections. We haven't done enough of that civic literacy piece. So we have a lot of energy and we have a lot of willingness for young people to want to get activated and engaged with the political process, particularly in Gen Z. But then they realize, oh, wow, I got to wait till I'm 18 before I'm registered to vote. Okay, well, here's some other things that you could do to support the institution, support this part of the process. Oh, you're 17. Okay, well, hey, you could become a poll worker. 61% of poll workers are over the age of 60. We need more people under the age with my 17-year-old who's very interested in doing that. So we need to do that. The other thing is that we need to understand, as far as voter suppression is concerned, voter suppression is very real. But more Black votes, it's a very simple formula. More Black votes equals less white supremacy. And the one thing that can reverse voter suppression is more Black votes. And so that's why I keep stressing maximum voter turnout. That's how we're going to have to overwhelm, particularly in some of these states like Georgia, for example, overwhelming the polls. People stood in line for hours, waiting for a movie ticket for that big box set, or waiting in line for like the next smartphone device or next pair of sneakers. Okay, you can stay. We're going to have to be in a unified way. We're going to have to organize and mobilize and make sure that every last one of us, and we're all our support system, are doing that work and overwhelming the voter suppression in all those key battleground states, particularly down south. That's just the way that's going to have to happen. Another thing is that all of our various organizations, like the National Urban League and the NAACP, you are all on it. But we need those other support organizations like the National Bar Association. Where is it? It's 50,000 Black lawyers nationwide. So we need them activated right now between now and November as poll watchers, as people who can also be rapid response voter suppression lawyers and election watchers that are on the ground in these key battleground states, making sure that Black votes are mattering. So that's the kind of work that has to be done. And we have to see, like, okay, well, what organization is here in this state? What national organization? We've got a National Bar Association. We've got a National Medical Association. We've got this. The day right now, this is not the year for like conferences and galas and cute cocktail receptions. This is about real grassroots mobilization and work. That's what we need to be doing every day of the week. That's what I'm doing. That's what I have other folks doing. That's what the folks that I know, that's what we're all doing. That has to be the focus and the emphasis between now and November 8th.
Well, you know what? Thank you for that. I think you've touched on so many important points. And I will say this is a conversation that we have to continue. We have to keep talking about it. everyone has to do their part, because I think, as you all clearly laid out, elections have consequences. There is so much at stake. Our time is short, but before I close, I just want to give you each 1 minute, closing thought, final call to action that you want to share with our viewers now. And then, we'll move on and hope that folks take the information that was shared, and continue, I think, to push out the importance of getting a sizable turnout at this point. And we really need to make sure folks don't stay at home. So Jamal, Charles, 1 minute each, final thoughts, final words for those who have tuned in for this conversation.
Well, first and foremost, Jerica, I want to thank you and the Urban League for having this format and this platform. We got to keep talking and keep the messages out there about the importance of elections. The first thing I would lift up is volunteer, volunteer, volunteer. If you or your community members who care a lot about the community volunteer, it takes us to a different level of impact. And the NAACP, the Urban League, the Divine Nine organizations, I was at the Bar Association on a panel about voting rights. All of our organizations are working together, but we need more volunteer infrastructure and capacity. The second thing I would argue is invest in Black-led organizations. So if you're in Georgia, the New Georgia Project, my homegirl Insay Ufad, or Latasha Brown and Clint, who run Black Voters Matter Fund, they're doing great work because Fulton County is going to act a fool this election cycle. They're already pulling
early. They always do, Jamal.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
They're already pulling early vote sites out of college campuses in Fulton County. So you're going to need NAACP, Urban League, New Georgia Project, Black Voters Matter Fund to do that work, to fight back, and also to make it so that our sister Stacey Abrams becomes the governor of Georgia. We don't endorse, but we love her and know her vision and her leadership. The third thing I would argue is keep at it. Keep pushing, keep making noise, because the politicians, the editors of newspapers, the folks who are in positions of power, they have to listen to us, the people. And so if we continue to push and fight and make noise to hold them accountable, that is the way in which we get what we want done and we win and really flex our power, if you will. And so I'm grateful to this space and grateful to both Jerica and Charles for being in this space. But we say volunteer, invest locally, invest in your organizations, and keep making the noise that matters.
Love
Absolutely. That. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jamal. Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation too, Jerica. And thank you to everyone who's watching. We here as Black media, I mean, we're your platform, right? We're your staging ground, and we're all soldiers on this battlefield together, because it really is a war. And so it's an all hands on deck step up moment that we're in, and we have to realize that. And as we realize that, understanding how like the game or the rules of engagement work, and understanding this process more. We were talking about young people just a few moments ago, and we need to have those honest conversations with our millennials and our Gen Zers about exactly how this all comes together, how this all falls in place. We need a revitalization of civic literacy, and we need also a revitalization of confidence in ourselves as a very powerful voting bloc, particularly in a lot of these key states. And so definitely invest in Black media, as well as those Black organizations that Jamal just talked about, the NAACP, National Urban League. I mentioned one other, All Voting is Local. Those are frontline organizations. And also, more importantly, invest in our community. Invest in the communities that we grew up in. Invest in the communities that we're from. Invest back on the block. We cannot continue having this situation every election cycle, where we're leaving our most distressed communities. We're leaving the least of us, when we're leaving all these untapped voters, untapped and very powerful potential participants in this 3 Ps process that I've been telling you about. The protest, making the protest demand, winning at the politics, winning at the policy. We can't make that possible without all of us there, all together on the battlefield, winning this fight.
Thank you so much, Charles and Jamal. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the information you shared. And I want to thank all of those who tuned in for their leadership in advance. I saw in the comments, there was a comment that said, this is a step up moment. I concur. Everybody needs to step up. we all have a role to play in this work as we do what the National Urban League, what we, our tagline for our campaign is reclaim your vote. We have to do it. You have to get involved. It doesn't matter which organization you get involved in. You just all, it's incredibly important that we all do something. It's a collective responsibility. It's going to take our collective action and our collective power to see this thing through. So thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to the next conversation. And remember, the time for justice is always now. Go out and reclaim your vote, y'all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.